Morning guys, today is a controversial video, but I've been asked all the same to address that issue or to answer that question. And my topic for today is why can't I visit my own family in the Philippines? You know, COVID-19 has struck us all. It's such a big problem in terms of the economic development of the country, in terms of tourism, and in terms of not being able to travel abroad, and to an extent even not being able to see your own family. I fully understand the reasons why the Philippines wants to reduce the spread of COVID-19 and why they want to stop foreigners coming into the Philippines. The visa on arrival system that they had in the Philippines, i.e. you could get a 30-day visa on arrival, is a privilege. It's not something that the Philippines has to offer, but they do it to, one, attract tourism, and two, because it helps the Philippine economy. I understand the reasons, but that's been suspended, so the visa on arrival is not possible anymore. Not only does this apply to foreigners who are not Filipinos, but this also now applies to former Filipinos. Even the Balik Bayan scheme, for example, if I went to the Philippines with my wife who was a natural-born Filipino, I could get a 1-year stay under the Balik Bayan scheme. Even that has been suspended. So the issue is this. I want to see my family. I want to see my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, my godchildren, and of course my mother-in-law, my nanai. Now, of course, they all mean so much to me, and over the last 30 years I've been travelling back home to see them on a regular basis, and due to the current immigration rules I can no longer do that. Now, as I said, I fully understand the reasons for this. It's to reduce the spread of COVID-19. However, there's a lot of advances in technology that mean you can actually be tested for COVID before you leave your country of origin. For example, if I wanted to visit the Philippines, I could go to a clinic, I could pay £130, I could have a test to prove that I didn't have COVID. In fact, if I was to travel on certain airlines, maybe Emirates, Etihad, one of the requirements of traveling on that airline is to prove that you are COVID negative before you take that flight. But then again, I could take that test, and the day after I could contract COVID. The same would apply to a Filipino citizen. They could want to go back home to the Philippines. They could have a COVID test and they could pick up COVID from somebody else, so they could still have COVID. So I'm a little bit puzzled why the COVID test makes any difference, but I fully understand it. And of course, if I was a Filipino citizen, I would be able to travel back home to the Philippines. Now let's speak about the issues surrounding this. I understand that if you're married to a Filipina or a Filipino, i.e. your spouse is a Filipino, you are able to travel back home, and there are certain requirements. You need to pay for the COVID test, you need to pay for a hotel, for quarantine, etc. And I accept that. But for those people who are in a relationship with Filipinos, for example, they may have been in a relationship for 5 years. They may have had countless visits to the Philippines. They must be desperately missing their partner, but because they're not married, they can't go home and see them. And so far this has gone on for a few months, but say for example if it goes on for a year or for 2 years, clearly they're gonna fall out of love, or clearly it's not gonna work out very well, and this is going to cause problems for both of them. So that's one of the issues. And the other issue, of course, is the only way that you can physically go to the Philippines is if you are married to a Filipino who has Filipino citizenship. And this means that a former Filipino needs to reacquire their Filipino citizenship. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's a difficult time-consuming process. It's hard to get an appointment at the embassy. Some people don't really want to reacquire their Filipino citizenship for their own personal reasons. I would be in a position that you know, I would want to go back home, or I desperately do want to go back home, and I respect the law, and I respect the fact that the visa on arrival is a privilege, and I accept the fact that the Philippine government has a right to have that situation in place. The Philippine government has a right to invoke that, which they have. But for those of us who simply want to visit their family, their in-laws, their loved ones back home in the Philippines, it's really hard. I understand the reason, and I support the government, and I support their reasoning, but I just hope that there's a way that they can come up with some kind of solution. Whether it means COVID testing in your port of origin, whether it means COVID testing on arrival as well, maybe it's a 14-day strict quarantine when you arrive in the Philippines, and then after the 10th day you have another COVID test, and after the 14th day you have another COVID test, all at your own expense. I really do feel there needs to be some way of exploring how foreigners can get back home to the Philippines. One of the issues, of course, is the tourism industry. There's so many hotels in the Philippines right now who don't have any guests or have less guests, and so many resorts that basically these resorts cost thousands of pesos a month for the various taxes and fees that they have to pay, and they're not getting any tourism right now, and this is crippling an industry. And I really do hope that the government can find a way of getting past this, of finding a way of maybe a limited entry for foreigners under strict conditions. For example, I have my family back home in Pangasinan. I should have to be able to prove that they are my family and that I have a connection with them. I should be able to prove that although my wife is not a Filipino citizen, she was a former Filipino citizen, and I should be able to prove that in documentary evidence. For example, in the Philippine embassy in the UK, our marriage is registered, the birth of our children is registered. So it's very clear that I'm married to a Filipino who's then gone on to get another nationality, and right this moment in time she's not in a position to reacquire her Filipino nationality, so even she can't go home, and she wants to see her mum, her family, her sister, her brothers, and of course her nephews and nieces, godchildren, and she can't do any of that, and this is a crying shame. So I really do hope that the government can address this. Firstly, it's to encourage tourism into the Philippines and more spending from foreigners in the Philippines, and secondly, it's to ensure that people don't have to deal with things like depression and sadness, particularly those who are in a relationship with Filipinos. It's so hard that for month after month after month, I get messages all the time from foreigners who are in relationships with Filipinos who simply don't know when they can go back home. And this is something that I hope the government can seek to address. I know initially there were a lot of things in place, but now just to basically deal with the immediate threat or the immediate situation. But now I do wonder whether the government can somehow look at this a little bit more. And even if there are, as I said, a strict protocol in place, i.e. a COVID test before you leave the UK, a COVID test at the airport before you fly, you have to have a strict 14-day quarantine in the Philippines. On arrival in the Philippines, you have another COVID test. On the 10th day, you have another COVID test. And on the 14th day, you have another COVID test. And in the meantime, you stay in a designated hotel. But after your 14 days, I believe that there's no chance you whatsoever of having COVID. And that should be the time you should be able to go back home to your province. Like this video if you agree. You're welcome to comment, but I really do hope that we can ask the government if they would very kindly consider this. Thanks so much.